All right. Well, we are joined with Jason from Tablas Creek, and I am so excited. Jason, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your business and how it's going and the regenerative take you guys have on things?
Sure. So we are a vineyard and winery in Paso Robles, California. We're one of the pioneers of the California Rhone movement, which basically just means that we're dedicated to the grape varieties that are originally come from the Rhone Valley in the south of France. It's a partnership. Tablas Creek is a partnership between my family and the Perrin family, who have been making wine in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the regions around there since the early 20th century. So the idea when we started this in 1989 was to find a part of California where the raw materials, the soils and the climate and the rainfall were similar to what our partners were used to in Châteauneuf, and then bring in the grape varieties that they were used to working with, several of which had never been used in America before, and then kind of do a riff on those Southern Rhone Châteauneuf-du-Pape wines in a spot that seemed like it'd be a good fit for it. So that's basically what we did. We've imported 18 different grape varieties from France. We have them planted in our own vineyard here. We have about 125 acres of vineyard. We've also built a grapevine nursery and sold vine cuttings to hundreds of other vineyards up and down the West Coast, because it turned out we weren't the only ones who were interested in these grapes. In terms of our sustainability piece, we started off really by beginning where the Perrins work at their estate at Beaucastel, which is they have been farming organically since the 1950s. And they do it out of a conviction that that's really the best possible way to show off your character of place. I mean, this is a classic French concept, the idea of terroir, that you can make wine that tastes of the place in which it was grown and couldn't have been made anywhere else. And so we didn't know exactly what that signature was going to be here in Paso Robles, but we figured whatever that signature was, we wanted to give it the best possible shot to show. So that was our starting point. We started out farming organically back in 1989 when we got started. And little by little, it was that effort to show off the terroir and to minimize the things that we were putting on the vineyard from the outside that led us from farming organically to farming biodynamically and eventually to farming regeneratively. So it's the idea that the critical thing for us as grape growers and winemakers is minimize anything that doesn't come from the land itself. So that means, like, we started off applying organic fertilizer, which we brought in from outside, or applying compost that we brought in from outside. Now we have a big composting program that we do with all of the skins and seeds and vine clippings and all of that. We also brought in our own flock of sheep starting about a decade ago, and have grown from having a dozen sheep to now having about 200. And those turn our own weeds into our own fertilizer. So again, minimizing what has to come in from the outside and instead producing it here on site.
I love that. How long would you say that transition was? Definitely not a year. How long did that take you guys to start going from basic organic to regenerative?
It wasn't a single step. There were a whole bunch of different steps that were involved, and we were already doing a lot of composting before we got serious about it in 2010. But it was in 2010 that we decided to farm a 20-acre slice of the vineyard biodynamically. And we did it not particularly because we believed in the more mystical pieces of biodynamics. There's parts of biodynamics that are just really good farming, and there's parts of it which are kind of like pixies and fairy dust, lunar cycles, and things like that. So, but we did it out of this belief that what we were going to be doing is building soils that were really full of life, rich and resilient, that we were going to have soils that were going to be able to retain more moisture. We were going to be able to give our grapevines a little easier life. And this is a really stressful place here. Paso Robles is a high stress environment for any growing thing. It can be 105 degrees in the day in the summer and drop down to 60 degrees at night. We get all of our rain between November and April, and then it is dry for 6 months. There's hardly any topsoil. It's almost all, it's this rocky, calcareous shale. So it's old seabed. So these are not easy conditions for anything that's growing. And so everything that we could do to give those vines a little bit easier life, we felt like it might mean that we wouldn't have to replant our vines at 25 years old the way that a lot of our neighbors do. And we'd instead get vines that would live to 30, 40, 50. And that would be where the quality benefit would come, is that we'd have more older vines. But it turned out that the very first year that we switched to farming that 20-acre slice biodynamically, the wines that came out of those blocks floated to the top of our blind tasting trials when we do our blending in the spring. And the first year we kind of thought that was interesting and thought we'd see what happened the next year. The next year, the same thing happened. And it was not that these blocks were chosen for having been particularly great blocks in the first place. It was just the slice of the western edge of our property, which had high points and low points, thin soils and deeper soils, a bunch of different grape varieties, a bunch of different facings. And so we weren't sure exactly what the difference was, what had made that difference, but decided that we needed to try to farm more of the vineyard that way. And so switched from 20 acres to 40 acres in 2012 and continued to love the results that we saw. And we're eventually farming the whole vineyard biodynamically by 2016. So it was more a question of scaling up what we were doing than it was making it to be a gradual transition. I mean, we tried to do it in a very thoughtful and complete way in those 20 acres, but it's a different amount of work to do that in 20 acres than it is to do it in 125.
The scale is the key, right?
Yeah. And I mean, biodynamics is more hands-on than even standard organic farming. There's more things that you need to be doing at more different times, because a lot of what you're doing is essentially preparing your land and seeding it with the right microorganisms and the right species that will prevent you from having to intervene later. And so it is somewhat more hands-on and more labor intensive, and the work that you need to do in 20 acres, like to expand that to 40 and then 60 and then 100 and then 125, it takes a little more resources and a little more people and more time.
And how about that next step to regenerative? Did you find that was still super intense, or was that more manageable? How was the next phase that went after that?
So we were invited in 2019. Is that right? No, 2018. We got a call from the Regenerative Organic Alliance asking if we would be interested in being the vineyard and winery participant in their pilot program for the new Regenerative Organic certification. And at that point, we had never even heard the term regenerative. We were doing a lot of this stuff, but we didn't know the word. We didn't know it had a word. And so our first thought was, man, not another certification that we're going to have to deal with. But the more we looked at it, the more it appealed to us on a bunch of different levels. It appealed to us because it took the parts of biodynamics that we thought really mattered, the soil health and biodiversity and microbiome pieces of biodynamics, and separated it from the more mystical elements. And then it added commitments to reduction in the use of resources, because that's kind of a blind spot in both organic and biodynamics. It's not a question of are you doing the best you can with the amount of water that you're using, or are you using renewable energy? And these are, I think most people would say and understand intuitively that you should be doing both of those things if you want to be farming as responsibly as you can. But it's just not what those other certifications concern themselves with. So we liked that focus. And then it incorporated an animal welfare certification, which is something that we were doing anyway, and a farm worker fairness pillar that we thought was really cool. So it seemed like for us that it addressed the central weakness of biodynamics, and then added things that together felt like they would become the gold standard for responsible farming. And we thought if that was a program that existed and we had the chance to be a part of it and the chance to shape it for the wine community and a chance to advocate for it, then it was something that we needed to do. So a lot of the stuff we were already doing. I remember that the animal welfare auditor came and drove around with our shepherd for a couple of hours, and I guess half an hour into it, told him, you guys are so far ahead of the gold standard for this, you're great. You're not going to change anything. And then a lot of the soil health pieces we were already doing because of biodynamics, but the regenerative organic certification required us to to measure more things. So biodynamics is very process-based. Like if you do all of the biodynamic stuff, you're biodynamic. Regenerative organics requires that you measure the carbon content in your soil so that you can show that these techniques that you're applying are having an impact. So we had to be more systematic about measuring what we were doing, which I think just made a lot of sense. And then there was a little more that we needed to do on the farm worker fairness piece that I think we've learned a lot from and have found really inspiring, because what it asks you to do is, you start with a baseline. You have to be paying your farm workers a living wage and their working conditions have to be good. Like, great. Okay. We were already doing that. But beyond that, it requires that you involve them in the discussion and the decision-making of the work that you're doing. So we set up weekly roundtable discussions where we talked about what we had been doing in the vineyard over the last week, talked about what we were going to be doing, solicited feedback. And like, it's probably not surprising that that has a bunch of positive benefits, but it was something that we just hadn't been doing. It just wasn't structurally the way that we were organizing things. And that's been inspiring. It's been really cool to see, for example, our vineyard crew coming out on weekends and bringing their families to see the work that they've been doing. And like, you've got to believe that has all of these positive benefits in the way that they're working and the way that they're working together. So that's been a cool and inspiring new piece of it. So we didn't have to make big changes. It wasn't like the way that we were farming was not compatible with the regenerative organic standards. We were asked to be a part of the pilot program because we were already doing most of this stuff. Right. But having to be more formal about it, I think, has some real benefits too.
I would love to hear I know there's going to be a couple different levels of the benefits, but maybe just soil benefits, kind of what are the high level benefits of these formal regenerative practices that you guys were involving. Obviously, taste was one of them. And then I'd love to hear a little bit more about that inclusivity of the roundtable discussions, because, this movement, not only are they receiving fair wages, their input is valued, they're part of a movement that's, moving through the globe. Like, can you just kind of go over the different categories and where you guys are seeing all the benefits?
Sure. So I feel like there were really noticeable benefits in vine health and in wine quality in that transition from organics to biodynamics. So that I feel like we had kind of already banked those improvements, but I do know that some of the things that we've continued to do, things that we've done more recently, like we started applying and just in the last couple of years producing our own biochar on site, and that's one of the really powerful regenerative farming tools that we have in our toolkit. But watching the impact of the soils that we've been able to amend with this biochar, watching like the cover crop be 20% bigger than it is in the block next door. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic demonstration of vine health or of soil health. So that's a piece of it. Another piece of it is looking at how we've been able to be very systematic about the use of our flock. So as we've learned more, and let me back up a step, just because I'm sure some of the listeners here are probably wondering how this works in a vineyard environment, because wouldn't the sheep happily eat the grapes and the leaves?
That's a question we get a lot, so I'm glad you'll hit that one.
So we can only have our sheep in the vineyard after we harvest and before bud break in the spring. So it's basically from mid-October sometime until the beginning of April. But within that, what we do is we do this kind of rotational grazing, high density rotational grazing plan, where we'll keep this flock of sheep in a particular block of like an acre and a half for 24 hours, and then move them to the next block for the next 24 hours. So they move continuously throughout the vineyard. And because of the way that sheep graze, they don't pull grass out by the roots. They clip it like lawnmowers. So the day that they spend in that flock of 200 sheep is going to drop 750 pounds of manure, scatter it around the vineyard block, and then we move them to the next block before they overgraze an area, and then that grass regrows. And so we have now a plan where the sheep get through every block in the vineyard 3 times every winter. And you look at the cumulative impact of dropping like over a ton of high quality manure on every acre of your vineyard every winter. It's not surprising that the cover crops and the vines look happier.
Right.
So it's those sorts of things that I feel like they're not necessarily new to us since we started farming regeneratively, but they are a piece of that regenerative farming toolkit that we feel like has such dramatic impacts. So there's that piece. And then the second piece you were asking about the kind of our farm worker roundtable, our vineyard worker roundtables. I mean, it was hard at first because the natural hierarchy that in general vineyard crews work is that a winery talks to their viticulturist, decides what they want, talks to their vineyard manager. The vineyard manager tells the crew boss what needs to be done. The crew boss tells the crew what needs to be done. And then when they get done, they ask for what they're supposed to do next. So the information flows top down. And I mean, there's all sorts of potential issues with that I'm sure listeners can imagine. I mean, there may be a great idea that happens, but they don't feel comfortable passing it up the chain, or don't feel like it's going to get listened to, or it's going to be seen as a threat. Or there are potential language barriers, or there might be an issue. Somebody breaks a piece of equipment or sees that a piece of equipment is starting to break and doesn't want to say anything about it because they're worried they're going to get blamed for it. And so then you only find out about it when it is broken to the point that it doesn't work anymore. So those are issues with that kind of top-down communication approach. And those are all things that we've seen really measurable benefits from in the last couple of years, where all of a sudden our equipment doesn't break because people feel comfortable saying, okay, I think there's an issue with this, before it gets to the point that something is actually broken and everyone's like, oh, I didn't do it. Not my fault. And then one of the things that we did to start encouraging communication was to do a multi-day, essentially team building training exercise where essentially everybody is asked to talk about their lives, to talk about their relationship with this piece of land, to talk about their histories, and to go around and ask, like, specifically solicit feedback. And that's hard at first, but it starts a process. And then there were also like the classic team building things, like everybody is standing on an imaginary raft, which is really just a sheet that's on the ground. And how do you turn the raft over without anybody falling overboard? And it's all these things where you're kind of breaking down barriers to help jumpstart communication. And so just seeing the ideas that flow from that, but more than that, the comfort level that this vineyard team, many of whom have been here for decades, has now in speaking up, whereas before there would have been hesitation. So that's the biggest thing that we see, is that all of a sudden by creating these spaces where everybody's feedback is welcomed and solicited, you get information flow both down and up instead of just from the top down, and then who knows what happens at the end.
Yeah. Are you guys seeing kind of immediate solutions that, like, the tractors aren't breaking down in the field because people feel like they can talk? Are you guys seeing those benefits already come through with that?
Absolutely. That was one of the first things that we saw, is that our equipment broke a lot less.
And that's happy for everybody.
Yeah, that's good. This is good. Nobody wants to be working without 2 of their 3 tractors.
Right.
So yeah, that's been a big piece of it.
Awesome. And I want to pivot a little bit to the consumer side. You were talking that, biodynamic just rose to the top on taste tests. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of, you said you had never heard the word regenerative before. A lot of people who are consumers also don't know what that word means. How are you guys kind of breaking down that, oh, you really love how this tastes? Well, it's regenerative. How are you kind of working on that with consumers?
So I think one of the problems with regenerative is that it's a mouthful. Like it
Yes.
is a hard word to say.
That is what everybody
Uh,
is saying.
but I think the idea is intuitive in a way that maybe something like biodynamic is not. Um, so the idea that you can have agriculture be a part of the solution to some of these big picture problems like resource scarcity and climate change and things like that. Um, I think that's an idea that makes a lot of sense to people. They just don't know that there is a word that encompasses the ideas behind it. So I think a lot of it is a question of focusing on what it entails rather than on a name for it. So we spend a lot of time talking about and sharing pictures of the flock of sheep. This is lambing season. We have 200 lambs in the vineyard right now, and showing that and using that as a way of getting an entry point into the discussion of regenerative farming is I think a really easy thing to do. Same thing with some of the pictures of biodiversity. So again, people understand intuitively that like bare ground underneath a grapevine, like that doesn't look alive and vibrant. So sharing pictures of cover crops, sharing pictures of the owl boxes that we have that we put up to attract owls to prey on gophers so they don't eat the grapevines. I think it works not by talking a lot about regenerative from the top, but instead talking about all of the pieces that are involved in it and sort of building up that story into what it means. It'll be easier. We finally, I mean, this is all still new enough, but we've just gotten the approvals to start putting the regenerative organic certified logo on our labels, starting with the 2021 vintage wines that we'll start getting into bottle in February. And I think that's going to be a really good point too, because at that point there is a seal, there is something that people will see and then Google to figure out what it all means. That's going to, I think, connect the pieces of it in a useful way. Mm-hmm. But it is an ongoing thing. It's a question of like getting people telling the story on the channels that you have, and then getting people when they come to visit out into the vineyard and walking by the sheep and walking by the wetland area that we put in to treat our winery wastewater, and talking about how all of those pieces, all of the biodiversity, all the fruit trees that we have interplanted in the grapevines, how all of those fit together, it makes it real for people in a way that just saying it's regenerative farming probably doesn't.
Have you leaned towards doing more farm tours and things, or kind of what's your way? You know, of course, we're social media, we can post everything we're doing all the time, but what are kind of some other tangible ways that you're feeling like you guys draw people in? Is it through maybe wine education? Like what methods are you guys doing to kind of reach those people?
Well, we've always tried to get as many people out into the vineyard as we could, because it's you can talk until you're blue in the face, but you see it happening in the vineyard. It becomes real in a way that it didn't before. Obviously, that's a little harder in COVID times than it was before. I mean, we are now back to giving people tours, but there was a long stretch where we couldn't for a range of reasons, and where we just weren't seeing as many people because travel was more difficult, and we were having to communicate using electronic and social media tools. But getting people out there is a big piece of it. Sharing pictures when we do things that are live and virtual. I have a whole slide deck that I'm used to showing on Zoom, which kind of breaks apart what the regenerative farming looks like in practical terms. So even if people aren't with me physically in the vineyard, they'll get a sense of what that entails. And then trying to choose events where we have the opportunity to tell this story and share more than just standing behind a table pouring wine. I'm kind of over those sorts of tastings where you're just behind a table pouring wine to 500 people over the course of a day, and maybe you can get in 2 or 3 sentences about what each wine is. I've always prioritized events where I could do a seminar and again share some pictures and really get into the story and details. But I think the bar is even higher now for me to participate in an event, and it should be something where we can go deeper than just here's our Syrah, here's our white Rhone blend.
Do you find that consumers also kind of want more now? It's was great to produce a great product, but are you finding consumers are really starting to care about the animal welfare certifications? Are you finding any changes in consumer behavior around that?
I think it's been a steady growth in people caring about how the things that they choose to buy and choose to consume are produced. I don't think I don't know that it's something which has been a sea change like just in COVID times or in the last or since we got our regenerative organic certification. I think it's been something that more and more people have been interested in steadily over the last 10 or 15 years.
That's good to see. That's good to hear. It's, it's on the growth.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. And I think wine is in a really privileged position to tell this story because I think people think of their wines as coming from a specific place in a way that they maybe don't for most of the other things that they buy. I mean, yes, you want to know that the workers who are and the land that's growing the cotton for the shirt that you are buying, that the workers are treated well and the land was treated well, but you probably aren't visiting that cotton field.
No.
Whereas with wine, I think the translation of from how the vineyard is treated to how the wine tastes, I feel like that's a more direct line. And it's also the kind of thing that people want to do anyway. They want to visit the vineyards and see the way that the wines are produced. And it's maybe not quite a uniquely American thing, but it's certainly a particularly American thing. Our French partners are amazed that so many people want to come to wine country and visit the winery. For them, for most French consumers, the idea that you would go and visit where your wine was made is just as bizarre as deciding to go and visit where your shoes were made or where your bag was made. You just don't do it. You trust that what you get is a good product, and that's kind of as far as it goes. So I'm grateful that visiting wine country and going wine tasting is a thing in America and has really been a thing for at least since like Sideways came out 15 plus years ago.
Yeah. That makes me go back to thinking about you talking about your workers bringing their families to the farm. Do you feel like there's almost this shift to that agriculture was something you didn't want to see? It was something that happened and you want it to be done well, but you didn't want to see it. And now we're kind of encouraging that being a farmer wouldn't be the worst career in the entire world, that, there's almost a renewed sense of agriculture. Or is that kind of something you guys are seeing as well?
I hope that's right.
Okay.
I think there's still an awful lot of agriculture that people really wouldn't be happy to see.
I would say regenerative agriculture specifically.
Right. Yeah. So, but regenerative agriculture is a really small percentage of all the agriculture that's out there, and of course, it's only going to work to the extent to which it's rolled out more broadly. But I do think the idea that, the rise of farmers markets and the idea that you want to know your farmer and you want to visit a farm stand and you want to see the places and support the places that are farming in a way that you would want. I think that's a growing phenomenon. It was certainly not true, particularly when I was growing up 30 years ago. And it has grown steadily, and I hope it continues to grow.
And I guess we'll wrap up with my last question. For the farmers that are working nights and weekends and they have a hobby farm and they're doing this on their side and they really want to become full-time farmers, do you kind of have any advice on how you went from a rough piece of land and a dream of growing vines to making it the business that it is? That's a huge journey. What can you share about it to help others?
Oof.
30 years in 5 minutes, real quick.
Right. So I have two pieces of advice. Then they sort of address this from different tacks. One is if somebody is farming, maybe they're trying to farm mostly organically, but they haven't quite wanted to pull the trigger and go all the way, or they're not sure what the right step is to take. I would say approach it incrementally and understand that maybe you aren't at the point where you can get rid of all of your fungicides, but at least you can stop using herbicides and pesticides. Or maybe you're farming organically already, but you're using compost that you have to buy and bring from someplace else. Well, maybe you could start composting. There are steps, there are incremental steps that get you to really remarkable places if you keep taking those incremental steps. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is I think the most important marker of success, if you are trying to make farming into a business, is developing relationships with your actual customers. So the more that you can bring the people who will ultimately be buying your product to where you're growing it and get them inside your world, the more durable those connections are going to be. So that was for us the point at which like we started really being successful as a business, because our initial idea is that we were going to make these wines and sell them through the distribution network that our French partners' wines are all sold through. And I mean, those are great wines, and there's always lots of demand for them. And we just sort of assumed that the market would figure out that we were associated with Beaucastel and therefore would buy the wines. That turned out to be a much bigger leap than we had thought it would be. But it was the point in 2002 when we made the decision, okay, we've got to bring people in. Like we opened a tasting room. We started participating in a lot more local events and inviting people out. We started inviting writers out to come and write about what we were doing. We started a wine club, which started this ongoing connection with people that they would have a reason to come back every 6 months. And it was through all of those relationships that we built that this really became the successful business that it is. It is not through growth in our wholesale market. Even though it has grown, it still basically just breaks even for us each year. It's the relationships with the customers directly, and the fact that we can give them, because we're selling to them directly and cutting out at least 2 levels of a distribution chain, we can give them good discounts and still do better financially than we can in what we sell wholesale. It's that piece of the business that really makes us successful. So, and that's all possible because of those direct relationships, and because we've been able to keep people interested enough in this journey that we're on that they want to continue to be a part of it.
That's amazing, because I would really think that, I would assume that the wholesale would be the opposite, but it's amazing that you are kind of saying that it's small scale, people that are buying direct are really your bread and butter, because we always think of larger businesses, buying big and doing it a lot, but that's, is it that the margin is really great, or what do you, how did you sustain a small community effort?
So I think it's more that the wholesale wine market is a difficult market. It is legislated. So each state has its own licensing. You have to go through a licensed wholesaler. And if you want to sell a bottle of wine for $30 on a retail shelf, the retailer is going to expect to buy it for 20, and the wholesaler is going to expect to buy it for 15. So you have to, at that point, you're already selling it for half of what the end price is going to be. So that's just the way that wine distribution works. It also, because it is state licensed, there's also been a real move towards consolidation. So there are fewer wholesalers than there used to be, and they tend to have many, 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 many thousands of wines in their portfolios. So it's hard to break through. And a lot of the retail has consolidated too. There's a lot more chain retail and a lot fewer independent retailers and restaurants than there were even 40 years ago. So the wholesale market's tough, but the market in terms of direct sales, wine is the perfect product for that kind of long tail marketing, where we make 30,000 cases of wine a year. I mean, that's 360,000 bottles. That's a fairly large number of bottles when you think about it in absolute terms. But really, how many fans do we need to sell all of our wine each year? Like 50,000, maybe 30,000? I don't know, some relatively modest number, given that there are something like 70 million regular wine drinkers in the United States. So we need 0.1% of the regular wine drinkers to be fans of Tablas Creek. Is that enough to support a robust wholesale business? Maybe not. Is it enough for us to find enough customers who come here, get excited about what we're doing, join our wine club or our mailing list, get information from us as we do different stuff, and make that into a really powerful part of the business? Yeah, it absolutely is.
I love that. That makes it sound so very approachable to the people who are like, well, I can't possibly get a market share. There's too many competitors. And, the argument is forge a great connection, and they're there. You just got to find them and make the relationship worth it.
Yep. Yeah. And for us, we've always believed that like the most important thing is making sure that the customers who you have stay happy and feel valued. Because there's all this good data out there that it essentially costs 10 times as much to get a new customer as it does to keep an existing one. So you better do a good job of keeping your existing customers happy. And despite that, there are lots of ways that businesses fall down at that. And I think one of the easy ways to keep and build that connection is just to make them feel a part of what's going on. And that means regular communication. That means trying to demystify things that might be otherwise kind of intimidating or difficult. And it means taking great care of people when they come to see you. And I don't feel like that sort of thing is beyond the resources of most people who would want to be creating a farm-based business like this.
You make it sound so simple. We can all do it. Well, I love that. Do you want to go ahead and share the website and the social media so people can follow you? I mean, we'll be reposting all your great cover crop pictures and all the beautiful pictures you guys post, but if you want to share some of your handles.
Yeah, of course. It's all very easy. So it's tablascreek.com. And we are at Tablas Creek at all the major social media networks. One of the things I do want to give a little plug for is that if this sort of, either from a business standpoint, how you communicate what your business is doing and is all about, or if from a consumer standpoint, you just want that inside glimpse into the things we're working on, we've been keeping a blog, basically writing a blog a week for 15 years at this point. And that's linked off of the Tablas Creek homepage. And check it out. I think it's something that I'm really proud of, that it's not just me, it's a team effort, but it's a way of, again, bringing people inside our world and communicating not just about what we're doing in the field and in the cellar, but also about the business and about the reasons why we find this work so compelling. And I think if you can tell that story, if you can get people into your own excitement, you're 90% of the way there.
I love it. I think lots of people would benefit from that. So everybody should definitely go check that out. I appreciate so much, Jason. And thank you so much. We'll send people your way and I can't wait to see the good work you guys keep doing.
Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate it.